Hello everybody, welcome back to the Juneau-Douglas City Museum. I'm Niko Sanguinetti, I'm the Curator of Collections and Exhibits here at the City Museum, and on today's episode of Curator Chat we're going to be talking a little bit about the 19th Amendment. Today, August 18th, marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave American women the right to vote. This amendment was the result of over 100 years of hard work by a dedicated group of women and men. Most women's suffrage activists came from very different backgrounds, they had different political associations, and they had different ideas on how they would achieve their goals. There were some who felt that a state-by-state offensive was the best means of achieving any real change, mostly at a state level with local laws. Others felt that change at a national level was the only sufficient outcome to doing any real change, and they were more willing to take a more militant path to that goal. Today we're celebrating the fruits of their labor with 100 years of women's suffrage. Of course, it's important when we're talking about the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage as a whole to look at who the 19th Amendment pertained to. At that time, of course, those of European descent, mostly white women, automatically were included in that as American citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave those of African American heritage the right to vote as well. So those would be the two main groups we were looking at. It did not include Native Americans because up until 1924 they weren't actually considered American citizens. Even after gaining citizenship in 1924, there were a slew of laws that were put into effect across the country, not only at a national level but at a state level, that really prohibited them from voting. Even though they had the right to vote, they were severely discouraged and weren't really utilized, so that difference between the ability to vote and actually doing it is a huge difference. Although at the time of the 19th Amendment in 1920, that wasn't even an option for them. It also didn't apply to immigrants or children of immigrants, and actually up until 1931, a woman's citizenship was based on that of her husband, and she could actually gain or lose citizenship based on who she married. And I didn't know this until I was researching this topic for various programs we've been doing talking about women's suffrage. And that really hits home for me personally as somebody who grew up in the United States. I have an American mother and a South American father, and so upon marriage, my mother would have lost her citizenship and I wouldn't be able to be an American citizen either. So a lot of these things, when we're doing historical research, kind of hit at that personal level, which I didn't realize as well. So actually, a lot of racial minorities weren't even allowed to vote until the 1960s. So even though we're celebrating 100 years, which is a fantastic milestone, we have to make sure that we're also looking at a more rounded historical perspective on who that really applied to. So I know that if I was there in 1920, I personally wouldn't have had the right to vote, as well as probably a lot of people watching this video. I'm going to talk a little bit about women's suffrage in Alaska, because that's where we're based. We're here in Juneau, and Alaska was a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of voting rights for white women. Alaska actually, with the Second Organic Act in 1912, was able to form its own territorial legislature. Before that, all decisions were made outside the state. And actually, in the very first territorial legislature in 1913, the very first bill to pass out of the legislature was House Bill 2. And House Bill 2 gave women the right to vote here in Alaska. And basically it gave them the same voting rights and based on the same qualifications as men, meaning they had to be 21, they had to have lived in Alaska for at least 1 year, and they had to be American citizens. So again, those same restrictions on who could vote. At that time, that would not have included anyone who was Native American and no one who was an immigrant or immigrant direct descendant. So again, ahead of the curve, but also slightly behind on the times. So 100 years, August 18th here, 2020, and we are still, I think, moving along in that direction. And it's always interesting when you're talking about 100 years. It seems like in some cases this giant chunk of time, but in some ways really not a large chunk when you're looking at the grand scope of human governance. And I think that so many people and places right now are talking about different political struggles and the fight for rights, and when we're talking about this massive milestone of 100 years, and even looking at it took over 100 years to get to where the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, and now us 100 years on, I think arguably are still fighting a lot of those same struggles. And so when we're looking at historical episodes like this, I always am so interested in where the connections lie between then and now, and has much changed. And I think depending on various perspectives, I know I have my own, I think we're all still moving forward and there's a lot still to be done in the world today. So thank you for coming with me today at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum, celebrating 100 years of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, and continue that fight for women's rights and women's suffrage. And thank you for joining us for our latest Curator's Chat. If there are any particular topics you are interested in, make sure you comment on our Facebook or YouTube pages, and stay tuned for the next episode of Curator's Chat and for some of our other videos like Guess That Object and other visits to places around town. Thank you again for joining us, and you guys have a great day. We'll see you next time.